All right, so we're back and ready for another deep dive. You ready to get into some serious Scrum stuff?
Always.
Okay, good, because we got the Scrum Study SBO guide,
Yeah.
and this thing is like, wow, the ultimate Scrum manual. It goes deep, especially when it comes to big companies and those like super complicated projects.
Yeah, it's interesting because Scrum, is often presented as this simple framework, but then you see how it actually works in these massive organizations with tons of moving parts. That's where things get really, really interesting.
Exactly, and that's what I love about this guide. It doesn't just scratch the surface. It like digs into the real world stuff, you know?
Yeah,
Like what are the actual challenges and how do you actually like make Scrum work when things get messy?
absolutely. It's all about the mechanisms, right?
Yeah.
The practical tools and techniques that companies can use to address those challenges and really make Scrum sing.
Yeah, like how do you scale Scrum when you have, like a gazillion teams and everyone's working on something different?
Yeah, and how do you keep everyone on the same page, make sure everything's integrated, and ultimately deliver a product that actually works?
Right. And I think that's what we're going to try to unpack today. So are you ready to dive in?
Let's do it.
All right. First things first. This guide makes a really interesting point right from the start. Scrum, it's not just for software anymore.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing how Scrum has broken out of that software development box. You see it everywhere now.
Right. It's like marketing, construction, even research.
Exactly. And the guide actually uses the term product in a really broad sense. It could be a service, a physical object, or really anything you're working towards.
So it's not just about lines of code anymore. It's about like any kind of deliverable.
Exactly. It's about outcomes, not outputs.
This is where things start to get really interesting for me. Think about like a construction team using Scrum to build a house.
Oh.
Instead of like sticking to rigid blueprints, they could break the project down into smaller chunks, you know,
Hmm.
like focus on one room or one feature at a time.
Yeah, so instead of trying to build the entire house all at once, they'd be delivering value in these short iterations.
Exactly. And at the end of each sprint, they'd have something tangible to show for it. Like, hey, stakeholders, check out this awesome bathroom we just built.
And the stakeholders can give feedback right there on the spot, which is so valuable in an industry like construction.
Totally. Because things change all the time, right?
Yeah.
Got to be able to adapt,
Yeah, it's a much more agile and responsive way of working compared to that traditional waterfall approach.
which is like planning everything up front and then praying that nothing goes wrong.
Right. And we all know how often that actually works out.
So yeah, Scrum versus traditional project management, it's a classic debate.
And the guide does a fantastic job of breaking down the key differences.
Right. It's all about highlighting how Scrum prioritizes people, flexibility, and constant adaptation.
While traditional project management tends to focus more on processes, heavy documentation, and a linear sequential flow of work.
It's like the difference between like navigating a maze with a detailed map versus like exploring a new city with just your instincts and a good sense of adventure.
I like that analogy.
The guide actually has this really helpful table that compares the two approaches side by side.
Yeah, that's a super useful reference point.
Totally.
Yeah.
But one of the biggest differences for me is how each approach handles planning and prioritization.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
Like in traditional project management, you spend so much time up front, like trying to define every single detail.
It's like trying to predict the future.
Exactly. But in Scrum planning is an ongoing process. You break the work down into smaller increments, and then you prioritize them based on value, and you refine your plans as you go.
It's a much more iterative and dynamic approach, which just makes sense in today's world.
Totally, because like things change all the time.
You got to be able to adapt.
And speaking of adapting to change, let's talk about one of the most fascinating parts of the guide, scaling Scrum for those really big, complicated projects.
Okay, yeah, this is where things get really interesting and really challenging.
Because like imagine you're a software company building a new platform with tons of different features and components.
Right. You might have separate Scrum teams for the user
Right.
interface, the back end, the testing, and QA.
Yeah, so how do you keep all these teams in sync? How do you make sure they're all working together smoothly and not just like off doing their own thing?
Right, because you don't want to end up with a bunch of disjointed pieces that don't fit together.
Exactly. And that's where the guide introduces this concept of Scrum of Scrums.
Ah, yes, Scrum of Scrums, the meeting of meetings.
Okay, so imagine this. You have representatives from each Scrum team coming together like in a mini Scrum.
It's like a Scrum within a Scrum.
Exactly. And they're basically sharing progress updates,
Hmm.
identifying potential roadblocks, and coordinating their effort.
And it's like a communication hub to make sure everyone's on the same page.
Right. And it helps to prevent teams from working in silos, which can be a huge problem in large organizations.
Because the last thing you want is for teams to be like reinventing the wheel or working at cross purposes.
Exactly. So the Scrum is Scrums. It's all about keeping those lines of communication open and
Wow.
making sure everyone's working towards the same goal.
And as you scale up to even larger projects, you might even have multiple layers of scrums.
Woo!
It can get pretty meta.
I know, right?
Yeah.
It's like Scrums all the way up.
But it's all about finding the right level of coordination to manage dependencies and prevent things from like spiraling out of control.
Okay, so managing multiple Scrum teams, that's one piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
But the guide also highlights the importance of like clear roles and responsibilities to support the process.
Yeah, you need the right people in the right places to make it all work.
And that brings us to the role of the Chief Scrum Master.
Ah, yes, the chief scrum master, the scrum sensei.
Okay, so this role is becoming more and more common, especially in organizations that are serious about Scrum.
Because they realize that you need someone to like champion scrum at the highest level.
All right, the Chief Scrum Master is like a coach, a mentor, and a guide for all the individual Scrum Masters across the organization.
They make sure that scrum is being implemented consistently, they provide support, and they act as like evangelists for scrum within the company.
It's like having a Scrum Yoda.
I love that analogy.
Right. Sharing their wisdom, guiding the organization on its Scrum journey.
But it's not just about having experienced individuals in leadership positions. The guide also emphasizes the need for a Scrum guidance body at the enterprise level.
Okay, so this is like a team of Scrum experts and stakeholders responsible for like setting standards and best practices.
Exactly. They provide guidance on addressing challenges, resolving conflicts, and basically making sure that Scrum is adapted to the specific needs of the organization.
So they're like the guardians of Scrum, making sure it's implemented properly and effectively.
Precisely, they're the ones who ensure that Scrum isn't just a buzzword, but a truly embedded way of working within the company.
So it's not just about replicating the framework. It's about like a shift in mindset, a commitment to continuous improvement, and a willingness to adapt the approach.
Absolutely, and that's what makes Scrum so powerful.
Okay, so before we move on, let's just recap what we've learned so far. We've seen how Scrum can be applied to all sorts of industries and projects. We've explored the differences between Scrum and traditional project management. And we've started to uncover the complexities of scaling Scrum for large projects and enterprises.
Yeah, we've laid a good foundation.
Exactly. And in the next part, we're going to delve even deeper into these concepts. We'll explore some specific mechanisms the guide provides for overcoming the challenges of implementing Scrum in the real world.
Sounds good. I'm ready for more.
Awesome. Stay
Yeah.
tuned. All right, so let's dive into some of those mechanisms the guide offers, for navigating the real-world hurdles of actually implementing Scrum.
Yeah, because it's one thing to understand the theory, but putting it into practice, that's where the rubber meets the road.
Right, exactly. And one of the most important things the guide highlights is establishing a clear definition of done.
Ah, yes, the definition of done. That's a classic Scrum concept.
And it might seem like a small detail, but it's actually super important for keeping everyone on the same page and making sure everyone's accountable.
Absolutely, because in traditional project management, done can be a bit subjective, which can lead to confusion and inconsistencies in the final product.
Right. It's like one person thinks something's done, but then someone else is like, wait a minute, there's still this and that needs to be done.
Exactly. But in Scrum, the guide emphasizes the need for a specific, unambiguous definition of done that everyone agrees on.
So there's like a checklist that everyone has to sign off on before something can be considered truly complete.
Precisely, and this helps to eliminate any ambiguity or misunderstandings.
So for example, if you're developing a new feature for a software application, the definition of done might include things like the code has to be written and reviewed. It has to pass all the tests. It has to be integrated with the main code base. And it has to be documented and user-ready.
Yeah, so it's not just about writing the code. It's about making sure that the feature is actually ready to be released.
Right. And by having this shared understanding of done, everyone knows exactly what's expected of them.
And it helps to ensure that the team is delivering a high-quality product.
Totally. It's all about accountability and transparency.
Now, another important mechanism the guide highlights is the sprint review.
Okay, so at the end of each sprint, the team presents their work to the stakeholders, right?
Exactly. They demonstrate the functionality and gather feedback.
And this isn't just a formality. It's a chance to get real input from the people who will be using or benefiting from the product.
It's an opportunity to validate assumptions, uncover potential issues, and make sure that the team is building the right thing in the right way.
So it's like a reality check.
Exactly, and it's a key part of the feedback loop that's built into the Scrum framework.
Now, speaking of feedback loops, The guide also stresses the importance of the sprint retrospective.
Ah, yes, the sprint retrospective, a time for reflection and improvement.
Okay, so during the retrospective, the team basically takes a step back and looks at what went well, what could be improved, and what actions they can take to optimize their process in the next sprint.
It's all about continuous improvement.
Right, it's like a team therapy session where everyone gets to air their grievances and come up with solutions.
Well, maybe not therapy, but it's definitely a time for open and honest communication.
Yeah, and it's about creating a safe space where people can share their ideas and suggestions without fear of judgment.
And the goal is to identify actionable steps that the team can take to improve their performance in the next sprint.
So these regular feedback loops, they're like built-in checkpoints to make sure the team is constantly adapting and delivering the bigger possible value.
Exactly. It's all about embracing that iterative and incremental approach.
Okay, so we've talked about the definition of done. We've talked about sprint reviews and retrospectives. Now let's move on to one of the biggest challenges of implementing Scrum in large companies or complex projects: managing dependencies between teams.
Ah, yes. Dependency is the bane of many a project manager's existence.
Because it's almost inevitable that at some point, one team's work is going to depend on another team completing their tasks first.
Right, and this can create a tangled web of dependencies that can lead to delays, frustration, and a whole lot of headaches.
It's like a domino effect where one delay can trigger a chain reaction.
Exactly, and that's why it's so important to manage dependencies carefully.
So what does the guide suggest?
Well, one of the most effective mechanisms is the Scrum of Scrums meeting, which we touched on earlier.
Right, so this is where representatives from each Scrum team come together to coordinate their work.
And these representatives aren't necessarily the Scrum Masters. They could be anyone on the team who has a good understanding of their team's progress and dependencies.
The point is to have someone who can speak for the team and make decisions.
Exactly, and the purpose of the Scrum of Scrums is to provide a platform for sharing progress updates, identifying potential roadblocks, discussing dependencies, and escalating issues if needed.
It's like a central command center for managing dependencies.
And the frequency of these meetings can vary depending on the complexity of the project.
Some teams might meet daily, others might meet a few times a week.
The key is to find a rhythm that works for everyone and provides enough visibility into the overall progress.
Another mechanism the guide suggests is using dependency boards.
Ah, yes, dependency boards, a great way to visualize dependencies.
So these boards, they can be as simple as a whiteboard with sticky notes, or they can be more sophisticated digital tools.
The point is to create a visual representation of the relationships between different teams and their tasks.
So you can see at a glance which tasks are dependent on other tasks and which teams are waiting on each other.
Exactly, and this helps to identify potential conflicts or bottlenecks early on.
That's like a traffic map for your project,
I like that analogy.
right? You can see where the traffic jams are, and you can take steps to reroute things.
And by visualizing dependencies and actively managing them, organizations can significantly reduce the risk of delays and disruptions.
Okay, so we've talked about managing dependencies between teams. Now let's talk about the role of leadership in scaling Scrum.
Yeah, because you need strong leadership to guide the process and ensure that Scrum is being adopted effectively.
And as we mentioned earlier, the Chief Scrum Master plays a crucial role in this.
They're the Scrum champion, the one who advocates for Scrum at the highest level.
Right. They mentor the individual Scrum Masters, they remove organizational impediments, and they foster a culture of collaboration and continuous improvement.
They're like the Scrum Sherpa, guiding the organization through the treacherous terrain of Scrum adoption.
I love that analogy. But it's not just about top-down leadership. The guide also highlights the importance of the Scrum guidance body.
Ah, yes, the Scrum guidance body, the keepers of the Scrum flame.
So this body is typically made up of Scrum experts, experienced practitioners, and stakeholders who are passionate about Scrum.
And they're responsible for defining best practices, developing training programs, and providing guidance on addressing complex Scrum challenges.
They're like the Scrum Council, making sure that Scrum is being implemented consistently and effectively across the organization.
Exactly. They're the ones who ensure that Scrum is more than just a buzzword.
So it's not just about having one person championing Scrum. It's about having a group of people who are dedicated to making sure it's successful.
And that's what it takes to really embed Scrum into the culture of an organization.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this part of our deep dive. We've looked at how to establish a clear definition of done, how to embrace regular feedback loops, how to manage dependencies between teams, and the role of leadership in scaling Scrum.
Yeah, we've explored some really important mechanisms for implementing Scrum effectively in real-world scenarios.
And in the next part, we're going to see how these mechanisms all come together to enable organizations to scale Scrum for large projects and even at the enterprise level.
I'm excited to see how it all plays out.
Me too. Stay tuned. All right. So we've talked about all the building blocks, like how to handle dependencies between teams and stuff.
Yeah, like those nuts and bolts of actually making Scrum work in the real world.
Yeah. But now let's zoom out a bit,
Right.
and see how it all comes together when you're scaling Scrum for those really big projects.
Right, because it's one thing to use Scrum for a single team project. But what happens when you have multiple teams working on a much larger initiative?
Yeah, exactly. And the guide talks about 3 levels here: projects, programs, and portfolios.
And most people are familiar with Scrum at that project level.
Right, like one product.
Exactly, but when you have multiple Scrum teams working together on something bigger, that's where the program level comes in.
Okay, so imagine you're a company developing a new mobile app.
Yeah.
You might have separate Scrum teams for the iOS version, the Android version, and the back-end infrastructure.
Right, so each team is working on its own distinct project, but they're all contributing to this larger program, the launch of the app.
And that's where things get really interesting, because now you have to coordinate all these different teams and make sure everyone's aligned.
Right, and that's where those mechanisms we discussed earlier become so important.
The Scrum of Scrums, the Chief Scrum Master, the Scrum Guidance Body.
Exactly. They all play a crucial role in ensuring that the program runs smoothly and delivers value.
So the Scrum of Scrums helps the teams stay in sync, manage dependencies, and address roadblocks.
While the Chief Scrum Master provides guidance and support to the individual Scrum Masters.
And the Scrum Guidance Body establishes best practices and standards, making sure everything's aligned with the organization's goals.
It's like an orchestra, all these different instruments playing together. You need a conductor to make sure everyone's in harmony.
Okay, I like that analogy. And then if we zoom out even further, we get to the portfolio level.
Ah, yes, the portfolio level, the big picture view.
Right, this is where you're looking at all the different programs and projects that the organization is undertaking.
It's like a strategic roadmap for the entire company.
And what's really interesting is that the guide suggests that Scrum principles can be applied even at this level.
Which makes sense when you think about it, because even at the portfolio level, you're still trying to deliver value. You're still trying to be adaptable and responsive to change.
Right. It's all about prioritizing the initiatives that are going to have the biggest impact and making sure that everything is aligned with the organization's strategic vision.
Of course, applying Scrum at the portfolio level is challenging. It requires a high level of buy-in from leadership and a willingness to embrace a new way of thinking.
But the guide does offer some guidance on how to approach it. Like, it emphasizes the importance of clear decision-making processes, metrics for measuring value, and a culture of transparency and collaboration.
Right. It's all about creating a framework that supports agility and responsiveness at the highest level.
And one of the key players at this level is that Scrum Guidance Body we talked about earlier,
They're like the strategic advisors for the portfolio.
providing guidance on prioritizing programs, allocating resources, identifying risks, and monitoring progress,
They're also responsible for developing and maintaining the Scrum portfolio backlog.
which is basically a prioritized list of all the programs and projects that the organization is considering or undertaking.
It's like a master list that keeps everything organized and focused.
So by applying Scrum principles at the portfolio level, organizations can get a better handle on their overall capacity, make better decisions about resource allocation, and ultimately deliver more value.
It's about taking that agile mindset and scaling it up to the strategic level.
So throughout this deep dive into the SBO guide, we've seen how Scrum can be adapted and scaled to fit all sorts of situations.
From small single-team projects to large multi-team programs, and even at the enterprise level.
And the guide really emphasizes that Scrum is more than just a set of rules or practices.
It's a way of thinking about work, a philosophy that values collaboration, flexibility, and continuous improvement.
And by adopting this mindset, organizations can become more adaptable, more responsive, and more successful in today's rapidly changing world.
It's about embracing change rather than fearing it.
So if you're thinking about implementing Scrum or scaling it within your organization, the SBOK guide is definitely worth checking out.
It's full of insights, practical tips, and real-world examples.
It's like having a Scrum expert on call.
Exactly, a guide for your Scrum journey.
So thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Scrum. We hope you learned something new and maybe even got a little inspired to try some of these things out in your own work.
It's been a pleasure exploring the world of Scrum with you.
Likewise, until next time, happy Scrumming.